It is my very great pleasure to be the introducer of our keynote speaker, Agnes Hubert, who I've known for quite a while and admired from afar and occasionally up close. She has been a fabulous feminist policymaker and voice within the EU. She has been an advisor to the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, BEPA, of the European Commission, since 2005. This is a high-level place to get some words about feminism in, and it's so nice to see her doing that. She graduated in economics, surprisingly enough, economics and political science at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. And as an EU official, she's held responsibilities in development and international cooperation, communication, social employment policy. Notice all of these things are very gendered. She's also served as the head of the Unit on Equal Opportunities for Women. She contributed to the White Paper on European Governance and was senior staffer to the European Parliament for 2 years. Particularly now in the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, she's a member of the analysis team that is responsible for reports on social innovation, youth, migration, gender, and well-being. Gender and generations, who could be better? She has a specific expertise in the fields of gender, social and employment policy, and fundamental rights, and obviously in her spare time, she has been the author-editor of 2 recent books, One Europe et les femmes, Identité en mouvement, and Democracy and Information Society in Europe, and is a participant in a number of feminist conferences, social policy conferences, social innovation, well-being, citizenship conferences, where I've had the pleasure to run into her at various times across Europe. And we are so glad to have her here and welcome her to Miami on behalf of both the Miami EU Center and the University of Wisconsin EU Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mara. Thank you for this far too flattering introduction. But some of the things you said, it's not that easy all the time to sort of do gender in an institution which remains sort of fairly male-dominated. But we're getting there. I mean, there are things which are changing. Anyway, I'm sort of the last thing standing between you and your dessert, but I mean, please feel free to sort of continue. Have dessert. I'm going to sort of try and, I mean, when Mara first sort of asked me to sort of come and take part in this conference, I mean, I was launching gender and generations. I mean, there's so many interconnections with so many things, and what I'm going to do is to try and interconnect with what I know best, right? And I hope it makes sense. But I mean, please excuse me if it does not sometimes. I like this because it's really the future of Europe. And in the recent years, I mean, with all the austerity policies and etc., I mean, at some stage, some of us were for the first time thinking, well, we've always thought that the European integration was a given and that we were sort of going on. But I mean, at some stage, I mean, I think we've passed that stage now, but at some stage we thought, well, I mean, what about thinking about disintegration as well? So, I mean, I like this because it really shows that, I mean, we are into the future. I want to thank Mara for this I mean, she's always been sort of very into innovative thinking and sort of getting new insights into the policy. And today, thinking about sort of gender and generations is particularly relevant. First of all, because gender equality is not a reality. We'll sort of illustrate that with figures, because inequalities are decreasing at world level, but increasing within countries and increasing very badly, because there are major transformations as well in generations. I hardly dare to speak about generations after after Jeff's sort of framing. I mean, I will say something which sort of, I mean, there are many more grandparents now because of the medical progress. It's very good news. I mean, but there are, I mean, a lot. I mean, longevity is certainly a sort of an asset of our century. There are less grandchildren. And there are much longer generations. The women are at the moment having 1.6 children as an average in Europe, and this rate is falling. The thing is, how will we organize, I mean, the real question is, how will we organize our welfare systems so that the middle generation does not sort of have to bear all the burden alone? But how do we reorganize it to ensure that the welfare state is not dismantling under austerity policies in a way that would sort of take back all the sort of reproduction economy on the back of women, right? Listening to the discussions this morning, to your presentations this morning as well, I was thinking very much of this paradox of the welfare state. It is true on the one hand, I mean, it's because of the welfare state that we've had women's lib, right? Because there's been much more sort of taking in charge by the state of a lot of things that women were sort of responsible for. But at the same time, what Chiara was saying as well, I mean, the welfare state has been built initially on the sort of gendered social contract. So this paradox is really what is really at stage now. I mean, there is nothing new in sort of trying to rethink the welfare state, and a lot of you have been sort of thinking in this term for a long time. But maybe now it is the opportunity not to limit our thinking to the mother's wage or any women's trap on how to sort of reform the welfare state, but to embrace the whole system with what I will come to, the measure of success, the GDP. So this is my conclusion, but now I'm starting my presentation. So gender equality for Generation Y in 2030, an EU perspective. I think I owe you some sort of definitions, right? Gender equality, we're not there yet. Generation Y, we'll come to that sort of specific generation that was born between 1980 and 2000, more or less. In 2030, because we are currently doing sort of a large foresight exercise, which I'll explain about, in an institutional EU context. So where I work is the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, and we are basically a group of about 15 advisors sort of advising the President of the Commission, So what our privilege is to be fairly free in the way we sort of address issues, and be innovative in order to sort of provide the President with sort of new ideas. So what I will sort of talk about is, first of all, definitions. We'll sort of go into the three issues that we'll talk about. Then what are the trends and challenges ahead? And then how is gender equality and I've added as well social innovation be a game changer? So gender equality in the EU, just to remind some of you that, I mean, it is a very strong asset of a constitutional right in the treaty. It's recognized as a value of the EU. It is to be promoted as a founding principle of the EU. It conditions sanctions and the accession of new member states. If you don't have a proper gender equality record, there is no way. Normally, yes, you should be be able to sort of access the EU. Then there is this very good and very bad sort of policy, which is called mainstreaming of all EU policies, mainstreaming gender into all EU policies, which is a commitment inscribed in the treaty. Then there is an article on equal pay and equal treatment, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Declaration on Violence add another sort of layer of rights which women can claim through the courts. Women or sort of people who feel discriminated on the basis of gender. It's been men very often. So gender equality doesn't exist. I mean, in EU average, we are 54% equal, right? Which is not a lot. And according to countries, you will see that in Sweden you've got 70%, and in Romania I think you're sort of 25 or 26%. Here we are, yeah. So this gender equality index has been made by the European Institute for Gender Equality, which is based in Vilnius, which is sort of an agency of the European Union. And it's a fairly sort of interesting index. We'll go onto the website because it's quite interactive. It takes work, money, time, health, power, and knowledge, right? And for each of these indicators, you've had long discussions about, I mean, what is exactly knowledge? What is, I mean, power? It's power in the public sector as well as power in the private sector. And they've taken as well, you see on the left, violence and intersecting inequalities as sort of issues which should have figures, but where we don't have enough figures yet to put them and to count them in the index. So I don't know which. Sorry. No. Can we go on one country? I mean, just to sort of see that it's interactive. Can we go on any country? Yeah. So take the best. It's just excellent. And then you've got the EU average and the way the country does. I mean, they do very well, for instance, on power as compared to the EU average, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, go on the internet and play with this. And I mean, it's quite an interesting and a new, very new instrument. It was launched in. I mean, they worked for it for about 3 years, and it was launched last June, in June 2013. Okay? Can we come back to the... Okay. So, sorry. So that was about gender equality. Then the second generation, I mean the generation Y, what is it, right? It's funny because looking on the web for Generation Y, you find all these sort of marketing companies or advising companies who are sort of trying to look at what Generation Y likes and what are they going to consume and how they're going to work and how to sort of make them sort of stay in their job and that sort of thing. So this is very sort of caricatural in many ways, but I mean Generation Y, the generation born in the 80s, from the 80s, was raised by boomers. The most important thing, I think, there will be, in fact, it's 70 million in the US, and I think it's something like sort of, I can't remember, can't remember it's 13 million in France and etc. But it is a massive generation, as massive as the baby boomers. right? And that's important. While Generation X, which was in between, was only 40 million, right? What is an important thing as well is the generation that lives for now and not for tomorrow. I don't know if you remember when this generation, some of you maybe, were sort of, the ones born in the 80s were sort of in their 20s or earlier. I mean, there was this fashion of sort of having a very low pair of jeans, and you always show your tummy. Right? And it was rather shocking. And some sociologists interpreted that by the fact that it means we are there, here and now, and we are sort of, we are present, and what is important for us is our center of being here. So they are also multitaskers. I'm sorry for the caricatures, but when we try and speak of these common identities, we've got to sort of speak about caricatures. Okay, and what is important as well, I mean, they really want life balance, and they've got sort of a little bit of different values than the sort of values of always progress, material progress of the baby boomers, for instance. So Generation Y and gender, will the sort of Generation Y girl or woman will be between 30 and 50 in 2030. Will she be multitasking in her job? Will she have to sort of look after her old parents? Will she be? The interesting thing in this picture is that she's got a lot of sort of things going on at the same time, but as well she's in the position of an Indian goddess, very zen, with a very sort of serene type of look on her face. So she sort of accepts this multitask, and she's got zen values. When we do, I mean, I asked the Gender Equality Institute if we could do some projections. So do not quote this, because they said, well, us as statisticians, we do not want to do projections, right? But I thought it was so informative when we were in the Beijing conference, for instance, sort of saying, well, I mean, we won't have the parity in position of power before 330 years, I think, I can't remember. I mean, they've been doing an exercise on the period, on the 10 years between 2004, 2003 and 2013, the evolution of the number of women in power positions in both the economy and politics, and then projecting it. And we see that in 50 years' time, right, we won't be higher than 75.3%. So, I mean, gender parity is not sort of completely on the cards. We'll be progressing but not that quickly. And as for Miss Generation Y, will be Mrs. Generation Y maybe by 2030. I mean, the rate of representation will be below 50%.
75% of what?
Of equality. Equal at 75%. So there will be, for instance, in a parliament, there will be 7.5 women for 10 men. Okay? Yeah. Okay? Yeah, is that clear? Yeah. So now I come to this exercise, which is called ESPACE, where we are sort of looking at what's going to happen in 2030. Just to give you a little bit of context, it's an interinstitutional project. You can see on the right-hand side, there is the European Commission, but as well the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European External Services. We've been working together in order to see how it was possible to sort of develop a common foresight capacity in order to sort of look at the big trends of the future and sort of adapt the policy of today to these trends. The first exercise was done about 3 years ago. We sort of asked a group at the EUISS, the European Institute for Strategic Studies, to do a sort of broad brush sort of picture of what was 2030 going to be like. They sort of came out with the idea that the empowerment of the individual was the very first thing. Then you had a sort of displacement of the sort of economic power towards the east, in particular towards Asia, and there was going to be a very growing middle class. We went into this, from this first study, we sort of had 3 other reports commissioned, which are down there, and you can download them. One on the economics, one on the social change, and one on global governance. So this is the context of this study. The good news is that gender equality, in many ways, feature in this studies. The bad news is that it features in a bit of a sort of with what I would say and what probably most of you would say a fairly limited understanding. I'm trying to sort of look at the. Well, unlimited. For instance, I'll sort of won't come back to my notes. The limitedness. For instance, gender equality is one of the factors which is almost naturally drawn by the fact that there is more education and more, new technologies, right? At the same time, some of the sort of dangers of having less gender equality, more digital divide, etc., are sort of underlined. But basically, the main trend is really that gender equality is going to sort of come naturally with that, and will be a push factor for change, right? At the same time, it does not sort of look actually how the sort of gender inequalities are constructed and how to deconstruct them at all. So looking at the mega trends, for instance, we've got in 2030 a globally growing and aging population. There will be 8.3 billion of us. When you think that there was only, at the time that Jeff was describing this morning, early 60s, there was 3 million of us on Earth. It's really mind-boggling. It is probably going to be one of the sort of peak, because afterwards, demographers, but I presume there is a few of you in the room, are sort of predicting a sort of a decrease in the increase of population worldwide, because the increase, of course, is not coming from Europe or from the US. It's really coming mainly from Africa, from Asia, and a little bit Latin America, less. The empowerment of individuals, it's from education, from technologies, and this empowerment is seen very often as sort of increase in participation. And from the increase in participation, we could sort of, it will lead or not to an increase in democracy or in sort of deepening of democracy. The question of inequality is one of the other mega trends. As I said before, there is less inequalities globally, but much more inequalities inside countries. And these inequalities, according to a recent book by a French economist who's been working very much with Atkinson, Piketty and Atkinson, it seems, these inequalities are sort of structurally ingrained in, I'm going to say, the capitalist system in many ways, because if you look at over sort of 1 century and more, I mean, you see that the revenue of capital has been, in average, 4%, and the revenue of labor has been 1%. Okay, and which means that it is ingrained in the system, and the fact that there has not been these inequalities have been bearable in the 20th century is because of the redistributing effect of 2 wars and the redistributing effect of the sort of what we call the sort of 30 golden years as well in Europe, where there's been much more redistribution, including with the welfare state. But I mean, for the future, inequalities at global level are really sort of going to be more important, apparently. Migrations and urbanization as well. There will be, massive migrations, and which is just a way to sort of balance the level of population in different countries, in different sort of continents as well. And probably we will have far less in Europe, and so a lot more migration normally. And it will be the same as well with urbanization. It will be 7 people out of 10 will live in urban cities. The rise of the global middle class. This is very impressive as well. How I said in Asia and the Pacific region, the middle class, which means the category of people having an income from $10 to $100 a day. Right? That's the definition which is adopted. There is about sort of 500 million Asians at the moment belonging to the middle class, and there will be 3 billion in 2030. So that sort of leads us as well to think about sort of new ways. In the EU and the US, I mean, we'll sort of remain at sort of fairly low level. I think in the US, there's a decrease of the middle class. So maybe because it's a big increase of the upper class, of the richest class, I don't know. But no, there will be a decrease of the middle class, probably an increase in poverty as well, both in the EU and the US. Amongst the mega trends, and this is important that we're sort of forecasting, the economic report is extremely pessimistic, and we are now sort of seeing much more questionings about the austerity policy that we've been leading in Europe in the recent years, because we're not getting out of the crisis. Some people talk about deflation, right? And we are sort of getting into a spiral of sort of lack of economic progress. So the impact of the crisis is as well likely to have an amazing impact still on Generation Y in 2030. I mean, not only on Generation Y, but Generation Y being in charge or being the main sort of labor force. Huh? We won't have a greener world, despite all the wishes of the ecologist movements, and the question of governance and the question of legitimacy and transparency, which is very much questioned at the moment, is really full of question marks. What are we going to have at sort of global level in terms of are we going to be able to maintain the UN system, the WTO, etc.? I mean, are we going to sort of have a sort of dismantling of the G whatever 8 to 7, etc.? I mean, what are we going to have as sort of governance structure, governance bodies, institutions, and at national level or at sort of regional level, how are we going to make sure that the political is sort of reaffirmed, or political elites sort of listen more to the people? So this was taken from the speech of the President of the Commission in last September in front of the Parliament. what do we need and what are the challenges that we are facing. The reason, there's nothing really original. Restarting growth, ensuring long-term sustainability, fighting unemployment, reinforcing social cohesion in an aging society, ensuring the security of Europeans, reinforcing democracy and participation, and turning the challenge of a sustainable Europe to our competitive advantage. This maybe we'll have to sort of think about it a little bit more later on. So this is nothing original, but at the same time, it is in every single of these 5 points. I mean, there is a specific role for women. In growth, in particular, I like this. This was a study made by a Swede called Asa Lundgren, who was. It was made a few years ago, but now the OECD has been taking up the argument as well that if you have perfect gender equality on the labour market only, right? But we know that you can't have perfect gender equality on the labour market if you don't have a bit more gender equality in society in general. But if you've got perfect equality on the labour market, you can increase at EU level. You can increase the GDP by more than 15%. Right? The OECD report that was made under the impulsion of Hillary Clinton recently got to the same. I mean, they got 12% instead of 15%. But I mean, really, there is a hell of a lot to gain for the economy. Is it the right way to argue? I don't know. We'll sort of talk about it later. So the 3 priorities of Europe, which have been fixed in 2010, the 3 priorities for Europe were fixed in a sort of 10-year strategy, which is called Europe 2020. And the 3 reinforcing priorities that were put is that we must go for a smart growth, for sustainable growth, for an inclusive growth. There was no budgetary constraint sort of ingrained into that strategy, but all this sort of the way we've been trying to develop the smart growth, sustainable growth, inclusive growth by sort of making sure that we had new programs in education, we had sort of new investment in digital society, and we are really sort of looking much more precisely at where was poverty originating and how to fight poverty. All this was sort of subject to budgetary constraints, which sort of broke the effect of a lot of the policies that were done. Where are we now? Sorry, it's a long text, but where are we now? We are in the midterm, or preparing the midterm of that Europe 2020 strategy, right? And we're seeing that, in fact, if you look at the figures, I mean, especially in terms of poverty, rather than sort of the reducing the number of people at risk of poverty by 20 million, we've increased them by 3 million, etc., etc., etc. Poverty is probably the most sort of significant sort of gap between the sort of political promises and the reality. So why is this, right? So we're asking now, why is this? Of course, then now we've sort of argued with a lot of and sort of nicely put discourse that we've got to sort of understand clearly the full impact of the crisis, to share a common diagnosis between member states about where we stand, right? So this is going to feed in the discussions between member states. Why haven't we succeeded, or have we so badly failed so far, right? To put things very clearly. So the fiscal imbalances, the real estate bubbles, I mean, all these elements, we know they existed before the crisis, but we've not sort of been radical enough, okay? And then, and this is the second thing I would like sort of you to sort of give me ideas about as well. It's behind the headline figures on GDP, it is also essential to look and sometimes rediscover the underlying trends and the structural change which are determining Europe's ability to grow. right? There we can see, this is also why we're understanding and stimulating the factors that drive progress towards the European 2020 targets are of critical importance. So we are in this period of sort of conscious examination, right? Where we are sort of looking at issues. So this is where, this is where we can sort of probably come back with, gender equality in the end. But what we can sort of say is that, is the materialistic culture that we've been sort of continuing to sort of defend by continuing to defend a sort of rate of debt according to GDP, and having GDP as the sole sort of measuring factor, is that sort of sustainable not only with our environment, but is it going to be what Generation Y wants, this materialistic culture? Another thing we're saying is the contribution to well-being are ultimately the basis of the value creation in the real economy of value and products. We're starting to following the Easterlin paradox, right? We are, there are a lot of research sort of showing that, the well-being of population not only is a critical factor if you want to improve growth, but as well that it has become, the growth that we've been leading so far in many aspects is reducing considerably the well-being. So shouldn't we concentrate more on well-being and less on sort of creating more objects? Okay, then the last question, could we in the West lead the way towards a more sustainable growth based on well-being? So there are 3 questions on which I'd love to have your contributions. What are the game changers? Gender equality is certainly a game changer. Social innovation, I see it as a game changer because I've been working quite a bit on sort of social entrepreneurship and as well the context. How do you have sort of social innovators in public services, and how does that sort of change the way the welfare is sort of spending less sometimes and sort of being more efficient at the same time? So the game changers, if we're talking about a competitive Europe, the main resource in Europe is its human resources, right? The new sort of social strategy, social investment strategy that the Commission's put forward last year is really going into that direction, saying consider the social as an investment, not a spending, right? So jobs, care, education, youth, poverty, well-being should be the sort of the political priorities of a new Europe. For democratic Europe, gender equality is obviously sort of a test bed of democratic Europe. The representation of women is important, and the representation of youth goes with it. If you want to have a participative society, you've got to involve everybody. Okay? For promoting change, some of you who have been working on gender mainstreaming know how much this is a transformative factor. It's the reorganization of policies to actually better, or of initiatives of all sorts, to actually better integrate the needs of users. Then for resetting, do a reset like on your computer, to resetting the welfare state, I think social innovation has got a great potential as long as we sort of follow it up by not dismantling, but by reinforcing an adaptation. So what will Generation Y think about that? There's a few of you probably in the room. Another set of sort of stereotypes probably, but Generation Y, as it is described in a lot of this, sometimes sort of marketing sort of websites. I mean, they like new technologies, music, film. They're very much into creativity, right? They want to invest in social network and the share economy in general. I mean, I don't know if it's the case in the US, but I mean, this generation doesn't go to hotels anymore. I mean, they go to sort of Airbnb. They don't sort of take a car to sort of go from A to B. I mean, they do call up the BlaBlaCar or sort of car sharing things, and they. So, I mean, there's much more of this tendency to use the share economy. It's not necessarily by philanthropy or ideology. It's just because it's more practical. It's nicer. Then they need time for Facebook, Twitter, for their friends, etc. I mean, they don't put all their sort of their identity into their job, like baby boomers in particular have been doing. So it's only part of the story. Their identity is on Facebook as well. So, and then they most often need more meaning than and things that money can't buy. So I'm sorry for the very caricatural description, but these are the things which sort of, for me, are an indication that the question of well-being as a sort of primary objective of the economy is something which is going to resonate with them. Right. Then, as a conclusion, a sentence by José Manuel Barroso, the President of the European Commission, saying emerging of the crisis means entering into a different world. There's no going back to business as usual. He says it even more now that we're sort of saying that we are so bad on what has been done since the beginning of the crisis, and we're not really getting out of the crisis. The last sentence, which I think is important, is one of Nancy Fraser, who says, as a feminist, I've always assumed that by fighting to emancipate women, I was building a better world, more egalitarian, just and free. But at the same time, I've not added the rest. At the same time, she says, but what about leaning in? Is that the sort of neoliberal sort of egalitarian feminism that we're sort of talking about? She doesn't think so. And maybe we've made feminists have been making a few sort of mistakes about the way we've gone about sort of maybe sort of saying that getting more women on the labor market is increasing growth. Is it really what we want? Isn't it what we want to try to build a better world? Something which is going to be more look at the whole sort of picture and get into the economy, get into the banks, and sort of tell them what sort of wrong they're doing to the world. Anyway, thank you very much.
I had two questions. I was curious if you had thoughts about this new movement in Europe that is very active in France, but also you see in Italy and Spain and in Poland about precisely refusing gender, saying that we don't want gender equality, which seems to be a sort of populist movement. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And the second point was, and it's linked to sort of the groups I was talking about this morning. The second point is I was curious about your one of your points, which was gender equality as a representative of Europe. Or sort of as a feature of the European Union, and then I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the literature that's emerged in the field of either homo-nationalism or the idea that basically using gender equality as a marker of the West as a tool to discriminate against immigrant groups or to sort of police and to promote a kind of sexual exceptionism within Europe. So I'm curious about your thoughts on those two fields.
Well, there are two things I could say. I mean, there is an amazing confusion on the word gender, right, which has been sort of taken up by the press, and despite, I mean, it reminds me of John Stuart Mill saying that in order to convince people of something which is sort of supposedly common sense, you've got to use a disproportionate sort of amount of arguments. I mean, then the question of I mean, the way this term gender, sometimes you've got very good journalists who would really sort of, I mean, come back to the origin and sort of say, well, I mean, we're not talking about sort of desexualizing people or sort of having sort of everybody changing sex, but because this is exactly, I mean, you were showing this sort of papa and maman in the, and you've got to have sort of precise reference of a man and woman. Nobody has sort of contested that when you talk about gender, right? And the fact that gender is a social construction is sometimes sort of explained, but I mean in very, very sort of soft mode. And there are obviously people, I don't believe in conspiracy theory, but there are obviously people who want to sort of really instrumentalize that word to actually sort of contest some of the policies, the same-sex marriage, but as well, and then that brings me to your second question, but as well the question of the fact that the present government in France, in particular, is fairly forthcoming in terms of prostitution, in terms of equal pay, and I mean we've got a minister for gender equality who's very resolute and who's never put as many texts on the table of the parliament. So it's probably a bit of a reaction against that as well.
I'm wondering about if there's in this idea of promoting gender equality and the welfare, and we're thinking before about the welfare state, and I came here thinking much more about generations as just children and their parents, children and their people and their children, rather than Generation X, Generation Y. And so in the system of, how we will arrange for children to be cared for, parents to old people to be cared for, and so on, there's a generational dimension to that. So I'm wondering what you can say. What bothers me in the U.S. is this is the place of marriage in this, and they not very symbolically important. I think the federal government took about $1 billion from the welfare budget for poor people and spent it trying to convince poor people to be married. And the idea was that the purpose of welfare reform was to increase marriage, and the idea was that if the federal government was going to spend money to help poor people, it was crazy to throw good money after bad and trying to take care of poor people who wouldn't even essentially take the trouble to get married. So, is there any European parallel to this, or is there anything that you can help us, that you can say?
I mean, the attitude towards marriage is really funny. I mean, as much as the baby boomers were refusing marriage, and they still sort of made children, maybe not enough, maybe too many, I don't know. But I mean, they still made children with or without marriage, right? On the other hand, I mean, walking along Miracle Mile yesterday, I mean, the amount of wedding dresses on this, I mean, convinced me that there is a real upsurge of marriage here. And I do think, I mean, talking with a lot of my friends as well, who said, oh, but I'm really desolate. My daughter wants to get married in white. And I mean, there is, a lot of sort of upsurge towards marriage. So what is the attitude towards marriage at the moment? I don't know. The thing, it seems that marriage is very much a sort of a commercial enterprise, right? I mean, there's a hell of a lot of money that goes there. So probably in the US, you will continue to have a lot of marriage as well. We don't have that drive in Europe. But is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I'm not sure but it's probably my sort of baby boomer sort of prejudice. But I'm not sure that marriage is an essential component of the of sort of fertility and continuity. On the contrary, as you in your own sort of research look at, you've got this sort of marriage and divorce, and then we recompose, and I mean, parents who've been together sort of continue to look after their children, and so there's a complete recomposition there, which policymakers have not sort of really taken on board very much.
I think that one problem in Europe, in the European Union, is that it's true. We do not have this obsession with marriage in terms of policy, or at least not luckily at the European level, but also for a bad reason, because the family regulation is left to national government. So with the consequence that family law and family relationships are the less portable across EU borders, then so we are let's say a political and economical area which is based on the freedom of movement, but you can move easily. Now I see that Germany is curbing even movement by the EU citizens who are poor, but that is it's a recent development. But as a worker you can move, but it's much more difficult to move your family if your family is not within a very narrow definition which is common across all based on marriage and heterosexuality. As soon as you are heterosexual but you are in a civil partnership and live in the Netherlands and want to come to Italy, your civil partner you are not a couple. If you adopt one child as a single person when it is allowed, and you move to another country where this is not allowed. So actually this is a problem that the European Union has never really tackled, because it has decided to leave it to because it's a very touchy issue. It's very, very touchy, but in terms of mobility and in terms of it's a way, and also of intermarriages, international marriages. This is really, really a difficult issue. But then I want to go back to my original question, which is linked to what she was asking. Sometimes, Agnes, I would like you to step out of you being part of the Commission and to really say what you think. Okay, you cannot do it. You cannot do it, and I said it. Okay, I said it. Because, I'm a European, EU citizen, and I was listening to your interesting discourse. I was thinking, but our US friend must say, but we must be crazy. It's all jargon. We promise we want to relaunch Europe 2020 is an example, because they did it in the middle of the crisis. It was not that the crisis happened after they had planned the Europe 2020. Mm-hmm. We were already in the middle of the crisis, and they were speaking about decreasing poverty, increasing employment.
It was just the beginning, 2009.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, and then right away they did the austerity pact and the fiscal compact. And then they said, oh, surprise, surprise. Not only in Greece, but even in Germany, poverty has increased. Actually, in Germany, it has increased together with employment, which is a very strange thing. They have never been have never had such a high employment rate, but they have never had such a high poverty rate. So employment. So really, we should do something not only about policies, but about speaking about policies. Okay? So, because really. And then going back to gender mainstreaming, I think we had discussion about that, and I think you agree. I mean, gender mainstreaming was a good idea in principle. It had very bad results because they forgot all about it most of the time. It became an add-on, but not really a perspective that should be pushed through in our policies. This is the first thing. But I think that in the criticism that somebody has with regard to gender equality, I think that even Mary wrote about that, is that gender equality, to a large degree, both in public European discourse and in policy making, has been framed as making women more like men, in terms of having women have the same chances as men, without thinking that if men have those chances, is because women don't, to begin with. But not only women don't, but women perform what men do not perform, and therefore they are free to go out and do that. So if they do not tackle, if this is not tackled, it is true that for women, for some women can be a very, very good, for all of us who have had a career and so on, but for most women it's just a hard time, because it is the mandate to have a dual life. And only two things, family and work, and nothing else, because 24 hours are 24 hours. Sorry.
Agnes, thank you very much. Could I ask you to step back in now to your role? And I just wonder, you've been there such a long time, I think. Well, I think you've been there a long time, at least 30 years, I imagine. Right. And I wonder, what moment do you think we're at now in gender equality, or the significance of gender in the EU at the present time? Because I think there is no doubt that the EU was, and Jeff mentioned it already this morning, I think it was a force for progress at one stage. Certainly in my country, Ireland, you can trace a lot of the most progressive legislation in the 70s and the 80s to the EU, and that's true of other countries as well. And I just wonder, when you place where we are now against a kind of historical background, where do you think we are with regard to the significance of and the acceptance of gender inequality as a problem for the EU and by the EU?
I want to. I think it is. Is it on? Yeah. I want to carry up what you're saying, because if I look at the Netherlands, everybody thinks the Netherlands is this terribly egalitarian country. Well, it isn't. It's a very, if we go by women, it's a very, very backward country. Only 30% of women aged 18 to 65 are economically independent, and economic independence is defined as making the social protection minimum, which is net minimum wage, meaning that in the Netherlands, women can afford, by marriage or because of the expansive welfare state, can afford not to work themselves. So there's that one part of the country, and then there's also the part which is very pro-abortion and pro-euthanasia and pro-gay marriage, and so it's very split. So thanks to the European Union, we at least have legislation on women's equality, on discrimination in the workplace, on discrimination in wages, and a lot of the gender equality as it's related to work. So that is wonderful. But I think in Europe, and that's where we're running into the national countries, it's becoming very, very difficult, given the enormous differences. If we take the point of Philip, thank you, Philip. On marriage, if we look at the different regulations and if we look at unmarried cohabitation in the Scandinavian countries where it's virtually identical to being married, possible exceptions might be vis-a-vis children. So I do not, given the enormous institutional differences in the family but also in national governments, do you see any movements within the European Union to start moving legislation regarding family relationships towards reducing inequalities across countries there? And I'm also thinking more broadly of, for example, the position of grandparents, whether grandparents have access to their grandchildren, or laws, like I know that there are European laws which mandate grandparents to do certain things or not. Do you see any movement in the European Union that would try to create some kind of harmonization there, or is it just much too touchy? And that it's safer somehow, given the history of the EU, which has always been focused on economics and on an economically sustainable future, and not necessarily private circumstances of people, which still very strongly structure the life chances that they have and that they grow up with.
I mean, the competence of the European Union is very much sort of limited, you say, to economic affairs, but it's been enlarged to sort of justice and home policy as well in the Treaty of Amsterdam. So we've got a little bit more competence. But where we feel, and according to the team in charge at Commission level, will be more or less sort of ambitious, right, in trying to push a number of sort of, I mean, the interpretation of the text, basically. There's been probably over-ambition in the law period in the 90s, and in the recent years there's been a sort of return of the balance towards sort of probably less ambition. But still, in terms of justice and home affairs, the main competence is when there is when it has something to do with the free movement of persons, which is one of the four sort of liberties, or one of the four founding principles of the European Union. So, I mean, in terms of, I wouldn't be just as sort of pessimistic as Chiara, who knows the issue very well and very often from really precise case studies, but still I wouldn't be just as pessimistic. I mean, the issue of sort of, for instance, women being able to sort of get their children back or things like that, I mean, has really been very, very high on the agenda, or going higher on the agenda. I mean, at European level, brought into the Court of Justice and the Court of Justice as statutes, sometimes brought into the European Court of Human Rights as well. So I think the issue is progressing. If I see, it's even more essential if I sort of see some of the work on European integration, which is done by original thinker like Virginie Giraudon, for instance. I mean, you see that, I mean, the real sort of European integration is done by marriage or by people sort of living together. And so, I mean, this is really a very important issue. In the last, when did it start? I mean, but in the last few years as well, there's been, with the Commission that started 5 years ago, there's been this report of the European Parliament on Citizens Europe, which was really pinpointing all these sort of very specific issues about sort of the transfer of rights, etc., that were really, I mean, an obstacle to for citizens to actually understand what was going on at European level. I mean, how it was sort of serving or not their needs. So I think this is improving on the. I mean, it's increasing on the political agenda. Then maybe to try and answer the question of Mary, on where are we in terms of gender equality. I think we've had a golden period probably in the 90s, where a lot of things were happening, and were at the center of the European strategy for employment. So there was a lot of things where gender was seen with its sort of leverage capacity on other policies. I am not, maybe because I'm sort of stultified on that, but I'm not sort of as pessimistic as you about gender mainstreaming. I know, and I'm very grateful of all the academic work that has been questioning gender mainstreaming, that has been looking into gender mainstreaming, how it works, how it's been recuperated by people who didn't want any gender equality at all, etc. There's a lot of downside to gender mainstreaming, but I still believe that it is an institutional instrument which has an amazing transforming capacity when it is properly implemented. It is not always properly implemented, etc., but it is still something important. So where are we standing now? I mean, number one, the first 10 years of the century were about sort of getting women onto the labour market at whatever cost. Right? Whatever cost was something like sort of working for €6 an hour, €7 an hour, etc. Right? So the quantity of jobs were the most important. Okay? Then came the crisis, and the crisis, the focus was on the car workers. Right? The focus was on the people in banks who were losing their jobs, and it was not. I mean, gender was a sort of subsidiary issue, despite all the sort of academic articles that were sort of pre-warning, say, beware. I mean, there is a very big, very sort of big gender inequalities that you also be digging here. But I mean, gender was not an issue. I think it's coming back a little bit more. If I take the latest sort of European and social policy development report, which was published a month ago, I mean, it has got now a full chapter on gender and the crisis. Gender employment is going below, and the I mean, they're not preconizing the best solutions, probably. I mean, they're not going very far into sort of thinking. They say, okay, we must have more kindergartens, we must have more flexi time, right? Coming back to Holland, more flexi time, right? A paradise for gender equality, because women have got more time to spend with their children. But I mean, anyone can do part-time, but I mean, it's only women who do it, right? And very few men, even though you've got a little bit more men than in other countries, but hardly. So part-time is not in the system as we're sort of working on now. It's not a solution, right? Last but not least, I will say that I often feel that I'm sort of stepping out of the political correctness of the European Commission too much, and I like to speak off the record. But that's another story.